This morning, we're just going to skim the surface, and we're going to look at some principles that will help us understand this book. And you see the handcuffs up here. We're going to be looking at principles that are Holy Spirit inspired principles that we'll find right in the text that will handcuff us to the type of interpretation we're going to come up with. Now, it's been my privilege to teach the book of Revelation at the Tri-City School of Preaching and Christian Development. Just about 2 weeks ago, I did a series at a congregation on the book of Revelation. We covered it in 7 hours. And I say that to say we're not going to be going into that kind of in-depth study today. But the principles that we're going to be looking at right from the text will help us understand truths that will help us refute probably 95% of the false doctrines that you come across. I'm also going to share with you a couple of other ideas about just read the text. One of the problems that we have regarding the book of Revelation is there's been so much superstition superimposed on the book. And we listen to everything around us, and we get concerned about that. Now, the book of Revelation, the word revelation is singular, not plural. I know that. But I'm going to ask you a question. Have you had this experience? When I preached in Abingdon, Virginia, I preached there for 26 years. And people from small towns, so folks knew me. And I would have folks come up to me in the grocery store, especially after some type of traumatic world event, war, something like that. And they'd say, "Preacher, it's just revelations being fulfilled right before our eyes, isn't it, preacher?" Have you kind of had that experience? And people think, "Oh, I kind of see how things are unfolding in the book of Revelation." Well, now let me say to you, first of all, unfortunately, for many years, our brethren, I'm going back 50 years, I grew up being taught kind of a continuous historical approach to the book of Revelation. And there was a dear elder in the congregation where I was at that time that he understood these signs, but he put on 20th century glasses. We're in the 21st century, but that was the 20th century. He put on 20th century glasses to understand first century things. You can't do that. You've got to use the Bible itself as an interpretation, and then also you look at it from the standpoint that they looked at it. And so I like to call it the contextual approach. There's a lot of different things that people call it. In school, you probably hear about being exegetical or exegesis. You pull out of the text. Now, there's another term that I call it the pre-decided approach. The technical term might be eisegesis. We kind of insert in the text what we want to find. What I'm saying to you is let's just take out of the text what's there. Let's not put anything else into the text. If there was an old well around here and you dropped your bucket down and you pull that bucket up, you expect to find water, just water, and hopefully it's pristine, clear, fresh water. Now, if you pull that bucket up and you find a baby shark, you know one thing for sure. That shark is not native to that well. Someone threw that shark in the well. Well, so it is with the book of Revelation. People come up with all kinds of ideas. Hitler, Mussolini, Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, they're not in the book of Revelation. So let's just look at some of these simple principles that are inspired by the Holy Spirit. Number one, and I grew up being told this. I grew up being told, I'm not sure that anybody can understand the book of Revelation. I'm not really sure that anybody is supposed to understand the book of Revelation. Hogwash. In verse number 3, there's a blessing pronounced upon the reader, the hearer, and the keepers. Now just think about how nonsensical that would be to pronounce a blessing upon these three, and then you can't really understand it anyway. Think about the idea. Now, you're going to be blessed if you keep the things in this book. Of course, you can't understand it. It's absolutely ridiculous. The book of Revelation is not that tough. If you asked me to come preach a series on the book of Romans, I'd say, whoa, I don't know about that. I'll be honest with you, the book of Romans is a lot tougher than Revelation. But because of all this outside stuff that's been dumped on Revelation, we get really nervous about it. All right? Let me give you a second point. The message is in symbols. In verse number 1, it's actually, we see this word in verse number 1, signified. Or think about it this way, signified. It's signified language. Now, why do I pronounce it that way? Well, think about what does a sign do? It's late one night. OC's coming back from Memphis, and he gets a late start, and he's tired, and he thinks, I'm not going to make it. I'm going to have to find me a hotel room. And he sees a sign on the side of the road that says Holiday Inn Express, 10 miles. And what's he do? He pulls over at that billboard, and he just parks the car. He said, I'm so glad to be here. You think, what's wrong with that boy? The sign is not the destination. The sign is pointing to something else. And that's true with miracles this way. The sign, John, that's the exclusive word that John uses for miracles in the Gospel of John, is signs. They point to something else. Well, these symbols, they point to something else. And we need to understand that. Now, this is really important, because if we want to take a loosey-goosey approach to this, you can come up with any doctrine you want to, because when you want it to be symbolic, it's symbolic. And when you want it to be literal, it's literal. Something in the text has to dictate whether it's symbolic or whether it's literal. All right. And then the message is one that John saw. Now this is really important. I want you to look over at verse number 11. And he says, this is Jesus speaking, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. And what you see, write in a book. What you see. Now this is important because it is a picture book. And we're going to go back and talk a little bit about symbols here in just a moment. But it's a picture book. And if you can get the picture in your mind, don't approach the picture and immediately try to start thinking about, now what's this mean? I see this dragon, and I see this land beast, and I see this. And just get the picture in your mind and let the text unfold. Now, it seems a little bit odd to us. This is a particular genre of literature known as apocalyptic literature. Incidentally, that word apocalyptic or apocalypse, it's really funny the way we use the word in modern usage today. You hear on a newscast, you look like an apocalyptic scene. Well, they mean disaster, doom, gloom, that sort of thing. The word apocalypse comes from a Greek word which means to be revealed. I did that because if you think about the curtains being pulled back at a theater, you're wondering, what is this play going to be about? What's the point of this play? And as the curtains pull back, you begin to see the story. And the point of the book of Revelation is the faithful child of God wins. The faithful child of God is victorious. And so that's very important to remember. So it's a picture book, and it's a symbolic book, and we're used to that. We get a little spooked when we come to the book of Revelation, but we're used to that. We use symbolic language. If nobody looks at newspapers anymore, but back in the day when they looked at newspapers, you open up the paper the day after an election, and there's a cartoon in there. And the cartoon is of an elephant and a donkey. And both of them have black eyes and cuts and bruises. And it's the day after an election. What's that mean? Both the Republicans and the Democrats got beat up in this election. We understand that. If you saw a picture of an elephant grabbing a donkey and swinging that donkey by his tail the day after an election, you'd know what that means too. We use symbolic language all the time. So, well, I'm just saying that to say don't get nervous when you come to the book of Revelation. Now, this next point is a big one. This message will be fulfilled shortly after the writing of the book. Now, there's 5 verses that you ought to know about. I think I've got them listed for you. Revelation 1:1, 1:3, 22:6, and 22:10. And then Daniel 8:26. The book begins by saying these things must shortly take place. Verse number 3, for the time is near. Now that's the way the book begins. You kind of begin to get the idea that this is about stuff that's about to happen. And then the book closes, 22 verse number 6, things which must shortly take place. And then 22:10, do not seal the words of this prophecy, and we'll come back to that idea of do not seal. And then he goes on, for the time is at hand. Now if I start walking out that door, and as I'm walking out the door, I say, now in just a little bit, just very shortly, I'm going to do X. And just a little, the time is at hand, I'm going to do X. And then as I get to the back door, I say, now, the time's at hand, I'm going to do whatever, you know. You begin to get the idea, whatever I said I was going to do, I'm going to do it pretty soon. Well, that's the way the book of Revelation begins and ends. Now let's talk about this do not seal. If you go over to the book of Daniel, Daniel 8, verse number 26, Daniel's been given a prophecy which generally we understand was fulfilled within about 400 years. It has to do with Antiochus Epiphanes and his desecration of the temple. It's fulfilled within about 400 years. But notice how those 400 years are referred to in Daniel 8:26. Seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. Excuse me. Many days in the future. 400 years is considered many days, so seal it up. The primary application is not for that generation. Now you fast forward to Revelation chapter 22 and verse number 10. Do not seal up the vision. Do not seal. Why? Because the application, the primary application is for that immediate generation. Now let me say this. Let me talk about primary application and secondary application. The primary application was for those 7 literal historical churches and any churches in that area where these things might be read. Really Christians throughout the world. And so they needed to guard themselves and be prepared for problems that were going to arise, which generally understood, even though there's some differences about the dating of the book, generally our brethren understand it's talking about the Domitian persecution. And they needed to be prepared for that. Nero was extremely cruel. As a matter of fact, no one was more cruel than Nero. He perfected cruelty. But Domitian's persecution was much more widespread. As a matter of fact, in chapter 12, it refers to a flood of persecution. The devil was just certain that the Christians could not escape that flood of persecution. And so with that in mind, they needed to know certain things for dealing with that time period. Are there principles that can help us today? That's a secondary application. Sure. We face all kinds of issues today, and the principles that help them can help us. Whether it's a foreign enemy coming here and telling us that we can't worship, or whether it's a boss at work that wants us to do something that's unethical, or whether I'm just facing the problems of life, I know this. If I remain faithful, I win. And that's a great message for us today. Now, with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about this word shortly. Somebody says, well, shortly doesn't mean shortly. As a matter of fact, every now and then you'll hear someone become a little bit boastful about their knowledge of the Greek. You know, they're a Greek geek. Oh, shortly doesn't necessarily. Well, let's look at how that word's used. Over in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse number 14, there Paul says, and incidentally, well, let me just read this. He says, these things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly. Now, what's Paul mean? Well, I hope I can get around to seeing you, Timothy, in the next 1,500 years, 3,000 years. No. Shortly means shortly. Furthermore, look at this verse. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 14, Peter's referring to his own death. He says, I think it's right as long as I'm in this tent to stir you up by reminding you, knowing that shortly I must put off my tent. In other words, he's saying, I'm going to give up this body. I'm going to die. Well, when are you going to die, Peter? I said, shortly. So what's that mean? 2,000 years? 3,000 years? No. It means a very short period of time. Now, I think you'd see where I'm going. When the book of Revelation begins by saying these things that will happen shortly, the time's at hand, it ends the same way. What's it mean? It means exactly what it's saying. Look at this one. I love this. Galatians chapter 1 and verse 6. They hear a group of Judaizing teachers. They're perverting the gospel. And notice what Paul says. I marvel that you are turning away so soon. And it's the exact same word, takos, in the Greek language. I'm amazed that you're turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel. How long did it take them to pervert the gospel of Jesus Christ? Not very long. Not very long at all. And so when we approach the book of Revelation, we need to understand this principle. Everything that we read about, now you may struggle with this and you can come talk to me later. Everything in the book of Revelation was fulfilled shortly after the writing of the book. I tend to think within the first century, but it may have gone over into the second century a little bit, that everything was fulfilled. Now I know we got some issues about judgment, but I'm going to talk a little bit about judgment. Chapter 20 is the favorite playground of the premillennial dispensationalists. But if you read that text, just read the text, you're going to begin to see that it can't be the final judgment. Let me just tell you this. In chapter 20, it talks about Satan being bound for 1,000 years. What happens at the end of 1,000 years? He's loose for a little while. Okay? Chapter 21 is a beautiful picture of what we are enjoying today. Revelation 21 verse 9, and one of the angels came to John and said, "Come, I'll show you the bride, the Lamb's wife." Who is that? Who's the Lamb's wife? Who's the bride?
The church.
The church. So everything he talks about after that is the church. The Jerusalem coming down from heaven. I know that's not the way we typically look at it, but I don't know how to get around Revelation 21 verse 9. Now, having said that, if we understand everything has been fulfilled, what is that going to do to the vast majority of all the false doctrine we come across? I don't have a leg to stand on. And we're going to have to be familiar with some of these things, and we're going to have to know how to deal with them. And incidentally, let me just give you this one for a little bonus. Go over to chapter 7. This gets people tore up. In chapter 7, chapter 7 is answering the last question of chapter 6. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. But in chapter 7, there are 144,000 that are sealed. And these 144,000 are individuals on earth who are on earth because God is holding back his angels before he begins to deal out his judgment on the ungodly. He says, I want them sealed. Now the point of them being sealed is the idea that God's saying to them, I know who you are. Don't worry. Don't worry. Now some of them may get caught up in the turmoil, but they're not under judgment. You say, well, that didn't really seem fair. You're saying some of them are going to be caught up in turmoil and they may even die? Yeah, but they're not under judgment. That just doesn't seem fair. Acts chapter 12, James and Peter are in prison. James is beheaded. Peter is released. Which one did God take care of? You said it. Both of them. As a matter of fact, I'm not so sure that I kind of lean toward the idea James got the better deal, didn't he? He got to go home, be with the Lord. And so it's a matter of perspective how we understand this. So there's 144,000 on earth. And then I want you to notice verse number 9. After these things I look, and behold, a great multitude which no one can number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. Now, have you ever heard this nonsense that there will only be 144,000 in heaven? Have you ever heard that? The text, you don't have to be a rocket surgeon. The text itself destroys that. There is a number in heaven that there's of all nations, tribes, and tongues, it says, and they could not be numbered, and they're standing before the throne of God. That just destroys that doctrine right there. All we have to do is just read, and it will answer. Now, point number 5 this morning. In verse number 4, this message was sent to 7 literal, historical congregations in Asia in the 1st century. Now, what's the point of that? Whatever the message means, it has to mean something to them. If we come up with an interpretation that would not make sense to them, it doesn't make sense. think it was W.B. West that first coined this idea. He said, when we study the book of Revelation, we need to put on our first century glasses, and we need to think about it and study it the way they would. It's probably been about 35 years ago, no, not that long, maybe 30 years ago, I met a brother up in Mountain City, Tennessee, and he was an older preacher. He was old at that time. This was 30 years ago. And he wanted to talk to me about Revelation, and he said, you know, it's really interesting that until World War II, we really didn't understand the book of Revelation. Well, that tells me there's a problem right there. Why would God write a book that we couldn't understand for 1900 years? And he goes on to say, it wasn't until those soldiers began to storm the beaches of Normandy that we began to understand Revelation chapter 10 and the locusts and everything. And then he went on to say, and then we see the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, let me ask you this question. What would that mean to the 7 literal historical churches of the first century? Wouldn't mean anything. We got a message of comfort for you. We know you're going to be facing hard times. You know, Smyrna faced some really hard times. It's very interesting. That's the rich little poor church, or the poor little rich church. And Smyrna was the kind of place where there was no excuse to be poor unless you were a Christian. I mean, there was wealth all around them. But if you were a Christian and you refused to worship the emperor, you go to the local market, you want to go in, you make some pottery and stuff you want to sell, and then you want to turn around and you want to buy some vegetables and other things, and there's a Roman guard there saying, I need to see your documentation. And this is the idea, the mark of the beast. I want to see your documentation that you worship the emperor. Well, I don't worship the emperor. Well, if you go right over here and you worship the emperor, get your documentation, you can come back and go in. No, I said, I don't worship the emperor. Well, you won't be coming in here. And you will not sell your goods, and you will not buy anything that's here. That's tough. And I believe we see the idea of the scarcity in chapter 6 is the idea that they had to go to the black market. And in some cases, it would take them a day's pay to buy just enough wheat to be on a starvation diet for their family. It's amazing. And as you begin to look at it from their perspective, and this is a book of comfort and hope for them, what would they care? If somebody says, well, boy, I tell you what, now don't worry right now, because in 2,000 years, yes, Adolf Hitler will look really bad, but the Allied forces are going to come in and liberate all this. Wouldn't mean squat to them. So when you hear people talking about B-1 bombers or stealth bombers or Apache helicopters and all this, you know what that is? Someone threw that into the text the same way someone would have to throw a baby shark into a well for you to get one out. It's not in the text. It's just not there. All right. Having said that, this is an important one. People go to the book of Revelation to say, it's telling us about the coming kingdom. Well, there's a real problem there. First of all, John thought he was in the kingdom, and he wrote about people who were in the kingdom. In the New King James, verse number 6, and has made us kings and priests to his God and Father. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. Probably that word kings would probably be translated better kingdom. The American Standard 1901 translates it as kingdom. You say, no, I think it should be kings. That's okay. Royalty. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9 says we're a royal priesthood. Where does royalty dwell? In a kingdom. But the American Standard 1901 translates this kingdom. He's made us a kingdom. But I want you to notice that word made. Even in the English language you get it. That's past tense. When did he do that? It doesn't say he's going to make us a kingdom. One day we'll be a kingdom. It says he's made us a kingdom. Let's look at a couple of verses real quick. Mark chapter 9 verse 1, Jesus says to those who are standing there, he says, I say to you, that there are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the kingdom of God present with power. Now, we don't have time this morning, but we can see that fulfilled in Acts chapter 1 and Acts chapter 2, the promise in Acts chapter 1, and the fulfillment in Acts chapter 2, the kingdom coming with power. But let me just ask you this question. If the kingdom has not been established, how do we harmonize this verse with that reality? Well, there's a few ways we could do it. Number one, we could take the position that there's still some people alive right now who stood there and listened to Jesus say that. That's absurd. That's just absurd. Okay? We could take the position that Jesus intended to do that, and that's kind of what the premillennial dispensationalists did. You know, he came to earth to set up an earthly kingdom, but he couldn't get the job done, but he's coming back next time to get the job done. Major problem with that. How do I know if he couldn't get the job done the first time, he's going to get it done the second time? Or maybe Jesus is just alive. Or maybe Jesus is just out of his mind. There's one last option that I know of. Jesus meant what he said, and it was fulfilled the way he said it would be fulfilled. The kingdom was established within the lifetime of some who were standing there. Think about Colossians chapter 1 and verse 13. He's delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of his love. That's the church. The church. All right, now let me pick up my pace here a little bit. I was hoping to have time for y'all to have some questions, but I really need to put the pedal to the metal. Verse number 7. I can remember reading this, and I always thought this was an end-of-time verse. And I'm going to ask you to bear with me here. This is not an end-of-time verse. This is a verse about judgment in time. This coming with the clouds. It's coming with the clouds. It's the end of time. Well, Jesus used that same language in Mark chapter 14, verse number 60, when he was talking to the high priest. And he says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. When did he see that? Destruction of Jerusalem. Does that mean Jesus was literally on the clouds? No, that's judgment language. Now, let me talk to you for just a minute about judgment language. This is this was a concept that was difficult for me. All right? I'm still grappling with it. But it's only been in about the last 25 years that I've really began to come to terms with this. So think about this. There's end of time judgment and there's end time judgment, and they use the same language. Okay? And oftentimes we'll read about something that's end time judgment, and we think it's end of time, but it's not. Let me illustrate it. I'm going to color code it so that green is end of time, yellow is end time. So think about Jude. All right? So Jude begins with end time judgment, end time, and then goes to end of time. But I want to remind you, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterwards destroyed those who did not believe. Okay, in the wilderness. All right, verse number 7. And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he is reserved in everlasting chains under the darkness for the judgment of the great day. That's end of time, and then we're back to end time. As Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, in similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and have gone after strange flesh, and set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Eternal fire sounds like end of time. But he's talking about that fire of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's set forth as an eternal lesson. Now let me fast forward real quick. I'm going to skip 2 Peter there. Well, actually, let me just show you this. He talks about the flood. That's end time judgment. And then he switches over to end of time judgment. He talks about those who receive reserved for fire, the day of judgment and the perdition of the ungodly. And he talks about the fact that that there'll be a great noise and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Before we run out of time, I want to get over here to Isaiah 1. Isaiah 13, verse 1. Now, if you remember that verse right there, the rest of this will make total sense. The burden against Babylon, which Isaiah the son saw. Okay, Isaiah the son of Amos saw. Now keep in mind, This is a prophecy about Babylon in that time. Babylon was conquered by Cyrus the Great in around 539 BC. Now, notice what he says to Babylon. Well, for the day of the Lord is at hand. I will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will be limp, every man's heart will melt. Behold, the day of the Lord comes cruel with both wrath and fierce anger to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellation will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. Verse number 13, therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. Somebody says, man, that sounds like the end of time. Well, I know it's not, because verse 1 says it's about Babylon. But let me tell you this. If you're in Babylon, and you're among the elites, when Babylon falls, for you it's the end of the world as far as you're concerned. And end-time judgment and end-of-time judgment uses the same type of language, and we need to keep that in mind. I'll end with this, but let me cover this real quick. A lot of times people think this is the end of time right here at the end of chapter 6. All you have to do is just read the text. I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood, and the stars fell to the earth, as a fig tree drops its late figs when it's shaken by a mighty wind. Then the sky receded as a scroll when it rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its places. And that's got to be the end of time. Keep reading. And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains. You're going to be able to do that on the final judgment. You're not going to run from God. It's not going to happen. This is why I say just read the text and read it with an open mind. This is not the end of time. He's talking about judgment on Rome. He uses the same kind of language that he would. And what do? And they said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come. Who is able to stand? And incidentally, that's answered in chapter 7. Those who belong to God are able to stand. So, let me give you I think this is your last blank. The message is from the Eternal One. And there's just a number of passages. I think I have them listed for you. There was a myth in the first century. People would hear, Nero's going to be reincarnated. Nero's going to be reincarnated. And then maybe even some said Domitian is really Nero. And John's saying, you know what? The only eternal one is Jesus. And that tells me they didn't need to worry about Nero. They didn't need to worry about Domitian. And it tells me today, I don't need to worry about China. I don't need to worry about Russia. I don't need to worry about my neighbor down the street. I need to be concerned with being submissive and obedient to Jesus Christ. He's the only eternal one. I'm 2 minutes over. I would have taken questions, and you can ask me questions later, but thank you so much for your kind attention.